What if the one thing keeping a war machine alive was sitting on a stretch of coastline barely 5 miles long? And what if the people who built that machine truly believed they had already won, right up until the moment it started to burn? Before we go any further, if you want to actually understand this war instead of just watching headlines fly by, hit subscribe right now, because this channel is where the real picture gets put together, piece by piece. For months, there was a story being told inside Iran, repeated on state television, repeated by officials, repeated so often that people started to believe it. The story was simple. Hold on long enough, keep threatening the Strait of Hormuz, keep the negotiators talking, and eventually the American president backs down. It felt true for a while. In June, President Trump had a strike ready to launch against Iran. He said so publicly. Then, hours later, he called it off, pointing to fresh talks with Tehran. Oil prices dropped the second that news broke. And in Iran, that moment was treated like a victory lap. State media ran with it. Officials repeated it in private briefings. The message was clear. We made him blink. But that story was built on a shaky foundation, and it was about to collapse in the most public way possible. To understand why, you have to go back to where this entire war actually began. Not last week, not last month. It started on February 28th, when American and Israeli forces launched a coordinated wave of strikes across Iran. That first wave was devastating in ways nobody fully expected, including the death of Iran's supreme leader in the opening strikes. A shock that reshaped the entire leadership structure of the regime almost overnight. His son stepped into the role that followed, inheriting a war that was already spiraling and a government suddenly forced to prove it could still function. From that point forward, the pattern repeated itself over and over. Iran would fire on American positions and international shipping. The United States and its partners would intercept most of it, absorb whatever got through, and respond with strikes that kept growing in size, never shrinking. And underneath every single one of those exchanges was one physical location that mattered more than almost anything else in this entire conflict: Kharg Island. It is a small strip of land sitting off Iran's coast in the Persian Gulf, only about 20 miles from the mainland. On a map, it barely registers, but that tiny island is responsible for roughly 90% of everything Iran sells in crude oil to the rest of the world. Nearly every dollar funding the regime's missile programs, its Revolutionary Guard, its network of allied forces across the region, passes through the terminals sitting on that island. Whoever controls Kharg controls the financial lifeline of the entire Iranian war effort. So in March, the United States hit it hard. President Trump announced that American forces had carried out one of the most powerful strikes in the region in years, describing over 90 separate military positions on the island as completely destroyed in a single operation. And here is the detail that tells you everything about what was really happening. The strike deliberately avoided the oil terminals themselves, not because American forces couldn't reach them, because they chose not to, not yet. Think about what that decision actually communicated. It wasn't, "We're going to collapse your economy tonight." It was something colder and more calculated than that. It was, "We can see every inch of your most valuable asset on the planet. We just erased the defenses protecting it, and we are choosing, on purpose, not to touch the part that keeps you funded." That is not mercy. That is a warning shot, with the safety deliberately left visible. And if you look at what it would actually take to run an operation like that, you start to understand how seriously prepared the United States already was. Wiping out more than 90 separate positions in one night while carefully avoiding the fuel storage and loading systems sitting right next to them is not something done with a handful of aircraft improvising on the fly. That kind of precision requires guided munitions, live targeting data, and long-range weapons capable of striking from far outside Iranian radar coverage. It requires electronic warfare aircraft, clearing the skies first, blinding whatever air defense systems were still functioning before the main strike package ever got close. And it requires a huge support structure of refueling aircraft, because operations at that range, launched from carriers or regional bases, cannot function without tankers keeping the strike force in the air. None of that gets built overnight. That kind of capability takes weeks of quiet staging before a single plane ever takes off. Now here is where Iran's leadership made the decision that would define the rest of this war. After that March strike, they had a choice. They could read it as a warning, a demonstration of restraint that would not last forever. Instead, they read it as a ceiling. They assumed the worst had already happened, that the war would simply keep grinding at the same intensity, strike after strike, until eventually a deal got worked out, the same way these conflicts usually end. But President Trump had spent the weeks following that strike repeatedly floating something much bigger than another bombing run. In an interview that spring, he was asked directly whether the United States might actually seize Kharg Island outright, not just bomb its defenses, but physically take it and hold it. His answer was that it was absolutely on the table, that there were, in his words, a lot of options available. That is not a denial. That is a sitting president confirming, on the record, that a ground operation against Iran's most valuable economic asset was a live possibility, not a hypothetical one being floated for effect. And he kept saying it. Through the following months, he repeatedly threatened to destroy Iran's power infrastructure, its oil production, and Kharg Island itself if a deal wasn't reached, and the Strait of Hormuz wasn't reopened for normal shipping. By summer, the language had escalated even further, with posts describing plans to eventually take control of Kharg and other oil infrastructure entirely, drawing direct comparisons to actions the United States had already taken regarding Venezuela's oil sector. That is not a threat to damage a facility. That is a stated intention to seize it and operate it. Those are two completely different categories of escalation. Military analysts who study exactly this kind of scenario have been very direct about what an actual seizure would require. It would mean Marines going ashore, supported by helicopters, with naval and air forces establishing total control over the surrounding sea and airspace before a single soldier sets foot on the island. And experts have been just as blunt about the risk waiting on the other side of that operation. Kharg sits well within range of Iranian artillery on the mainland, along with whatever missile and drone capability the Revolutionary Guard still has left after months of strikes. Taking the island might be the easy part. Holding it under sustained fire from 15 to 20 miles away is what turns a symbolic victory into an open-ended military commitment. Putting American troops physically on Iranian soil could be one of the most psychologically damaging blows imaginable to the regime's authority, which is exactly why it remains on the table and exactly why it has not happened yet. So that is the setup. Months of build-up, months of warnings, and a regime convincing itself that a single paused strike in June meant the entire threat had been called off. Then July arrived, and the fragile ceasefire that had briefly held over the summer fell apart. Strikes resumed, and within days, explosions were reported again on Kharg Island, this time alongside renewed strikes on nearby Keshem Island, part of what Iranian state media has previously described as the country's coastal defense network. Iranian state press reported multiple blasts on Kharg that night. International reporters geolocated footage showing explosions and fires further along the coast the same week, as the United States described a wave of strikes hitting more than 80 separate targets across Iran. This was the exact moment the "we broke him" narrative needed to survive contact with reality. It didn't survive. The island Iran had assumed was a closed chapter got hit again, this time inside a wave of strikes that also reimposed oil sanctions. The economic pressure and the military pressure landed on the same night, aimed at the same narrow stretch of coastline that keeps the entire regime's finances running. And it hasn't slowed down since. If anything, the pace has only intensified. Over the past several weeks, American forces have carried out consecutive nights of strikes against Iran without pause, something confirmed repeatedly in official statements. Then came the attack that changed the emotional weight of this entire war. Iranian missiles and drones struck a coalition air base in Jordan, killing American service members and leaving another missing before their remains were later found. That brought the total number of American troops lost in this conflict to at least 17, following earlier losses since the war began in February. These were the first American combat deaths from Iranian fire in months, and they reset the political temperature of the entire conflict overnight. President Trump asked about it directly, called it a very sad thing, and said the country hates to see young Americans lose their lives in service to the nation. Within hours, not days, hours, the American military answered with another consecutive night of strikes, hitting coastal surveillance systems, air defenses, and missile and drone storage sites. And for the first time in this specific round, officials explicitly named Iran's Revolutionary Guard as the direct target of retaliation for the attack in Jordan. That is not vague language. That is the United States telling a specific armed force, by name, that it knows exactly who was responsible. Before we go further, I want to pause on something important, because I think it gets buried under all the strategy talk. Behind every one of these numbers is a real person. A soldier in their 20s, someone's son or daughter, real families receiving news no family should ever have to receive. It's easy to talk about strike counts and strategic assets, but this war has a human cost on every side of it, and that part should never get lost in the noise. Now here's where things get genuinely tense, not manufactured drama, but real tension based on what's actually being reported. According to sourcing from multiple outlets, the United States had already begun moving additional fighter aircraft and refueling tankers into the region before that attack in Jordan even happened. That is not a reaction. That is a buildup that was already underway. And that same reporting suggests the ongoing strikes aimed at forcing the Strait of Hormuz back open are simultaneously being used to weaken the specific Iranian capabilities that would need to be degraded before any larger, more complex operation could actually happen. Sit with that phrase for a second. More complex operations. That is about as close as officials get to signaling, without saying it outright, that a ground operation on Kharg Island, alongside a possible strike on the underground facility widely linked to Iran's nuclear program, is being actively prepared for, not just discussed. And that underground facility cannot be separated from the Kharg Island story because officials have referenced both of them in the same breath, as part of the same next phase of this conflict. Iran's response to threats regarding that facility has been some of the most aggressive rhetoric of the entire war, with officials warning that a strike there would widen the conflict entirely and trigger broader retaliation against American allies across the region. That is the kind of escalation that either means nothing, empty rhetoric from a government that has bluffed throughout this war, or it means we are closer to something much larger than most people realize. All right, quick pause here. If this breakdown is actually helping you understand what's happening instead of just reacting to headlines, do me a favor and share it with one person who's been asking you what's really going on with Iran. That's the kind of support that keeps this channel doing deep dives instead of quick takes. Let's zoom out for a second, because Kharg Island is not burning in isolation. This war has pulled in a much wider region than most coverage gives credit for. Houthi forces in Yemen remain an active piece of this picture, with a standing blockade posture against shipping near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, another critically choke point at the mouth of the Red Sea that matters almost as much to global shipping as the Strait of Hormuz does. Analysts tracking this conflict have specifically flagged Iran's electrical grid as a potential trigger point that could push these other fronts into more direct action. Add in ongoing diplomatic pressure surrounding Lebanon, continued negotiation over troop withdrawals, and pressure on armed groups there to disarm, and you start to see the real shape of this conflict. This was never just a two-country war. It is a regional pressure system, with Kharg Island sitting at the center of the economic half of it, and that underground facility sitting at the center of the military half of it. So why does everything keep circling back to this one island specifically? Because it is the only lever that matters more than missiles. You can rebuild a destroyed radar site. You can eventually replace a damaged command post. What you cannot easily replace is 90% of your national export revenue disappearing overnight. Most of Iran's coastline is too shallow for the massive tankers that move crude oil at real scale, which is exactly why Kharg was built as a deep water terminal in the first place, with construction going back to the late 1950s and full operation beginning around 1960. For over 60 years, Kharg has been the funnel that nearly every barrel of Iranian crude has to pass through to reach international markets. There is no real backup. Smaller facilities exist, but none of them come close to matching Kharg's actual loading capacity, which by some estimates allows up to 10 large tankers to dock and load at the same time. You cannot replicate that kind of throughput anywhere else in the country. So when officials talk about seizing Kharg Island rather than simply striking it again, what they are really talking about is taking direct physical control of the one choke point that no sanction, no blockade, and no diplomatic pressure campaign has ever fully been able to replace. And that is what makes the entire "we broke him" narrative so spectacularly wrong. That pause back in June was never a permanent retreat. It was a single canceled strike window tied to ongoing back-channel talks. The moment those talks collapsed, and they collapsed hard, the pressure didn't just resume, it escalated past where it had been before the pause. The naval blockade against Iranian ports tightened further. Oil prices, which had dropped the moment that June strike got called off, came roaring back, with crude settling notably higher in the weeks since, reversing a meaningful chunk of the earlier price decline. And hanging over all of it is a legal deadline. A tariff authority tied to this conflict, passed under trade law, expires this week, 150 days after it took effect. That is not a soft political deadline that can quietly get extended. That's a statutory clock, ticking down at the exact same time this war just claimed new American lives, at the exact same time a threat against Kharg Island is sitting unresolved, at the exact same time a threat against that underground facility is sitting unresolved too. 3 separate countdown clocks, all converging in the same handful of days. Let's talk for a second about what actually seizing Kharg Island would require operationally, because it's easy to picture something simple, like flipping a switch. It isn't that. Military analysts describe the actual sequence as needing complete naval and air superiority established first, warships and fighter aircraft locking down the surrounding sea and airspace entirely before any ground forces ever move in by helicopter. Only once that dominance is secured would ground forces move in, likely with a final ultimatum issued to whatever Iranian forces remain on the island. That's the more manageable half of the operation, relatively speaking, because American forces already hold the kind of air dominance over this stretch of the Persian Gulf that Iran's degraded air defense network simply cannot meaningfully contest anymore. The harder half, the part that actually worries military planners, is what happens after the operation succeeds. Holding Kharg Island means holding a position within range of Iranian coastal artillery and whatever missile and drone capability the Revolutionary Guard has managed to preserve after multiple waves of strikes against the island's defenses. Analysts studying Iran's military posture have pointed out that Iran has spent literal decades specifically building the capability to keep foreign forces away from exactly this stretch of coastline. This isn't something Iran built last month. It predates this entire war by years, so seizing the island might take hours. Holding it under sustained pressure from a mainland 15 to 20 miles away that still has real capability could turn into an open-ended military commitment lasting months, maybe longer. And that is exactly the kind of prolonged troop presence that even the most hawkish voices in Washington have shown real hesitation about committing to. Which brings us to the actual logic sitting underneath everything that has happened around this island since March. Striking the defenses on Kharg without touching the oil terminal was never really about restraint for its own sake. It was a demonstration that only means something if the threat behind it is completely credible. You show a regime that you can erase 90 military positions in a single night while deliberately leaving the revenue-generating infrastructure standing, and the message writes itself. We are choosing not to touch your money right now, and that choice is entirely ours to reverse, on our timeline, not yours. Iran had a real opportunity after March to treat that restraint as an actual off-ramp, to use the space it created to negotiate seriously on reopening the Strait of Hormuz and escalate the broader confrontation. Instead, the regime chose to read American restraint as American exhaustion. They mistook a demonstration of control for a sign of weakness, and by the time Kharg Island's defenses were hit again in July, alongside renewed sanctions and a widening target list that now explicitly includes Iran's electrical grid and transmission network, the entire assumption Tehran had been operating on for months quietly fell apart. There was never a bluff to call. There was a demonstration that never got withdrawn, sitting there the entire time, waiting on a decision that has always belonged to Washington, not Tehran. So where does this actually go from here? Nobody, including the people making these decisions in real time, has a fully settled answer yet, and anyone telling you otherwise, with total confidence, is overselling their certainty. But here's what the reporting on the ground tells us to actually watch for in the coming days. Whether continued strikes finally extend fully onto Iran's electrical transmission grid, which multiple reports have flagged as a potential trigger for wider regional escalation. Whether the remains recovered near the attack site in Jordan get formally identified, which could push the confirmed death toll higher. Whether Congress moves forward with hearings or a possible vote on further military authorization, which would be the clearest legislative check on how far this administration can escalate. Whether Iran reports strikes reaching further inland, suggesting the target list is creeping away from the coast, and whether that statutory trade deadline arriving this week gets used as leverage, either tightened further as economic punishment, or floated as a bargaining chip in exchange for some kind of Iranian concession on shipping through Hormuz. Every one of these threads leads back to the same island. Kharg Island isn't a side story in this war anymore, if it ever was one. It is the mechanism. It is the thing that determines whether Iran can keep funding this fight at all, and it is the single physical location where American restraint and American escalation are both sitting right now on the same 5 miles of coastline, waiting on a decision that has not been made yet. And here's the part I think gets missed the most in the daily churn of coverage. This isn't just a story about oil, even though oil is what moves markets and grabs headlines. It's a story about how a government reads pressure and how badly this particular government has misread nearly every signal since February. They misread the opening strikes as something they could absorb and outlast. They misread the March strike on Kharg Island as a ceiling instead of a floor. They misread a single paused strike in June as proof that enough pressure would always make the American president fold. And now, with 3 separate countdown clocks converging in the same handful of days, a trade deadline, a threat against their most valuable economic asset, and a threat against a facility tied to their nuclear program, they are running out of new ways to misread the situation. Before we get to the last part of this, if you've made it this far, you clearly care about understanding this conflict properly instead of just scrolling past it. So drop a comment telling me which of these 3 flashpoints you think actually triggers the next major move. That kind of engagement is genuinely what tells this channel to keep covering stories like this in depth. At some point, perception has to catch up to reality. And the reality right now is that the United States has spent months demonstrating exactly how much capability it's willing to use. One restrained strike at a time, without ever suggesting that capability has a limit. So here's the question worth sitting with. Was Kharg Island always going to be the place this war either ends or fully transforms into something much bigger? Every thread running through this story, the oil, the casualties, the legal deadline, the military buildup already reported, keeps pointing back to that same narrow stretch of coastline. That is not a coincidence, and it is not going to stay a quiet, slow-moving story for much longer either. Do you think a ground operation on Kharg Island actually happens before the situation moves to its next phase? Or do you think this stays a threat that keeps getting renewed without ever fully being carried out? Do you think the underground facility gets struck first, given how directly Iran has tied these two threats together in its own public statements? Or does the trade deadline this week end up being the actual pressure point that forces some kind of deal before either operation is ever given the green light? All three of these paths are sitting on the table right now, and none of them rule each other out. Washington could let that deadline lapse as leverage in one direction, while still moving on Kharg Island in the very same week. Tehran could see this deadline as its last realistic off-ramp, and finally make a real concession on Hormuz to avoid a ground operation altogether. Or none of that happens. The strikes simply keep grinding forward the same way they have for weeks. This is a fast-moving situation, the kind where facts can shift within a single news cycle, so treat everything here as where things stood at the time this was put together, not as the final word on where it ends. If this kind of breakdown helped you actually understand what's happening instead of just reacting to another headline, subscribe, because the next update on this island specifically might end up being the most important one yet. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.